I'm Juliana Semione. I'm a researcher at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, and my research explores the question, what is freedom from slavery? Today, I'd like to share with you a few ways that individuals in the anti-trafficking movement define freedom. But before I do, I'd like to say a few words about the question itself. Why ask, what is freedom? And what kind of question is this? Well, a lot of high-quality research focuses on defining and measuring modern slavery. And most of us in the anti-trafficking field would say we're in it to end slavery. We use the word freedom casually all the time. We use it to describe a survivor's life after trafficking, or we use it in our campaigns and advocacy work. But what does it mean? Well, we risk talking past each other or working inefficiently in different directions if we're not clear about the meaning of freedom. So a central aim of my research is to bring unity and start meaningful conversations around our shared goal of freedom. So what kind of question is this? Well, it's important to understand this because it tells us something about the possible answers to the question, about the definitions of freedom I'm about to share. What is freedom is a subjective question. As most of the participants in this study affirmed, freedom is a highly subjective topic. So what might be freedom to one person might not resonate at all to another. So I didn't set out to formulate a one-size-fits-all definition of freedom. Rather, I've engaged with individuals from across the anti-trafficking field to learn their personal perspectives on freedom, and I've identified patterns in thinking. These patterns are the definitions that we'll be exploring. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about who participated and what participating entailed. There were a total of 73 participants in this study. 43 were from the United States and 30 were from the United Kingdom. Participants were divided into 3 cohorts: law enforcement professionals with anti-trafficking experience, victim service providers, and survivors. When I describe our definitions of freedom, it's important to remember that most of them are shared by a mix of individuals from different cohorts. For example, it's not as if all American service providers define freedom in the same way. I visited 3 locations in the US and 3 in the UK. In the US, I visited Central Florida, Southern California, and the greater Seattle area in Washington. In the UK, looking from north to south, I visited Central Scotland, Humberside in England, and the greater Cardiff area in Wales. So what did participating entail? Well, I could probably spend this whole time telling you about Q methodology, which is the means by which I captured individuals' perspectives. But I'll just describe what a typical research meeting involved. Participants were given 49 cards, which you can see here. Each one had a different possible definition of freedom printed on it. Participants sorted these cards first into 3 piles, depending on their level of agreement with each card. 1 pile for agree, 1 pile for neutral, and 1 pile for disagree. Cards from the agree pile were marked green, and cards from the disagree pile were marked red. You can see those markings in the picture here. So this participant, whose anonymous code is G5, agreed with the majority of cards. We can think of green cards as different parts of this participant's definition of freedom. And we can think of this image as a visual representation of their definition of freedom and the relative value they place on each part of freedom. I know you can't read the cards in this picture, but what's important for now is to understand how the overall methodology works. The 49 cards weren't arbitrary. They represent over 160 years of ideas about freedom from slavery, including freedom from the transatlantic slave trade and from modern slavery or human trafficking. Now, there's no shortage of individual ideas about freedom throughout history, but what's missing is a collection or analysis of these. Without an analysis, we've never known if there's any consensus around the meaning of freedom. So Q methodology looks at all the completed grids from all the participants, and it finds patterns or common ways of thinking. It uses factor analysis to understand where overlaps or consensus exist in the ways that individuals think about freedom. I'm going to share with you first the findings from the UK and then the findings from the US. Now, it helps to think about this as if we're in a theater. This is a seating chart for the Royal Albert Hall in London. On their website, you can see the view from different sections of seating. So here's the view from the grand tier, and here's the view from the gallery, and so forth and so on. Think of the definitions we're about to look at not as mutually exclusive options, but as different vantage points from various parts of the same theater. So every participant was thinking about freedom from human trafficking when they were completing their cue sorts. They were watching freedom on the stage, as it were, to extend our theater analogy. But they all have a different perspective or a view of that stage. Some more similar and some very different from one another. So our first UK definition, freedom is a secure place in an improved world. Individuals who define freedom this way place a high value on the cards that read, to live without fear, living in a world without abuse or oppression, and not being subject to prejudice, discrimination, racism, or misunderstanding. These individuals want a better world, even if it can't be a perfect world. They also emphasize different kinds of security, like having a place to call home and having your basic needs met. Definition 2 says that freedom is concrete securities in basic choices with no interference. These individuals strongly agreed with the cards that read having free will. Now, free will is the ability to do things without feeling coerced, controlled, pressured, or forced to do so. They also agreed with the cards that read being able to get the basic things you need to live a healthy and normal life and having a place to call home. Like the previous definition, this definition of freedom emphasizes having your basic needs met. But rather than focusing on an improved world to set the context for those securities, this definition prioritizes choice. For example, being able to do what you want and go where you want without anybody interfering or telling you no. Definition 3 says that freedom is personal resilience and a positive experience of the world. For these individuals, the most important qualities of freedom are having free will, never seeing yourself as a slave and never accepting slavery, even if others once treated you like a slave, and to enjoy being alive or to feel there is a reason to be alive. So personal resilience and a positive experience of the external world are prioritized between any basic needs or rights, before any relationships, and even before most choices. The fourth definition is freedom is survivor-centered, comprehensive resilience. This definition emphasizes the cards that read having free will, being healed from the damaging effects trafficking had on you, the process of adjusting to not being trafficked and being less impacted by your former trafficking experience, and to be able to defend yourself against people who try to limit your well-being, dominate you, or traffic you. Now, this definition is about survivors first. It prioritizes a survivor's ability to recover both psychologically and physically, and to adjust to freedom in their everyday life. But it's also about the community as a whole, and how one survivor's freedom makes a community more free. Think about it. If one person is less vulnerable to future victimization, then a community at large is that much more resilient against human trafficking. Our final UK definition conceives of freedom from human trafficking as self-determination in a fair world. This definition focuses on having free will, choosing your own lifestyle and shaping your own character, and determining your own way of life, as long as it does not negatively affect others. These three qualities of freedom need to exist in a fair world. And under this definition of freedom, fair means that everyone has an equal opportunity to thrive and there's access to justice against traffickers. So what do these UK definitions have in common? First, free will is important. You probably noticed how frequently the card about free will appeared on the screen. Well, in fact, 4 of the 5 definitions we discussed prioritize free will as the most important quality of freedom. Again, free will is the ability to do things without feeling controlled, coerced, pressured, or forced to do so. Under those definitions, a person cannot be free without free will, regardless of how many other aspects of freedom they might come to experience. Choice plays an important role in 2 of the UK definitions. These might be choices about basic aspects of your life, such as where you live and work, or choices about who you are at the core, such as shaping your own lifestyle and choosing your own character. Resilience is the final recurring theme. It plays an important role in 2 UK definitions. Although, as with the theme of choices, each of these definitions attaches a different meaning to the word resilience. It's important to remember identifying these common things can help us remember the general outline of the UK findings, but we can't reduce these definitions or combine them into fewer. because they all have nuance that would be lost if we did so. And if we allow the nuances to be subsumed under the themes we just discussed, then the definitions wouldn't look familiar to any of the participants involved. They would cease to accurately represent real-world definitions of freedom, and that would, of course, be against the point of the study. So there were more definitions of freedom that emerged from the US research than from the UK research. I'm going to share 4 of them with you, 4 that represent the greatest number of US participants. Remember, think of these definitions as different vantage points from different parts of the same theater. The first US definition: freedom is living without fear. Under this definition, the most important qualities of freedom are to live without fear, having free will, and being able to trust people and not being betrayed when you're kind to them. So fear no longer acts as a guiding or governing consideration in a survivor's decisions or relationships if they're truly free. This means no fear of being controlled, no fear of being betrayed, and no fear of your basic needs going unmet. The second US definition conceives of freedom as resilience against past enslavement and future harm. This understanding of freedom is largely internal to an individual, so freedom relies very little on others or on the external worlds. Its defining elements under this definition of freedom are having free will, being healed from the damaging effects trafficking had on you and healed from the physical harm that trafficking did to you, and the process of adjusting to not being trafficked and being less impacted by your former trafficking experience. Resilience against a previous trafficking situation involves recovery from all aspects of that experience. It culminates in a survivor's ability to live a day without reference to the physical or psychological experience of trafficking. And resilience against future harm involves having the ability to protect yourself against various types of harm, including negative consequences for leaving a place or a person or a job, including the ability to defend yourself against re-victimization, and against many other harms on the spectrum in between. The third definition from the US says that freedom is having dignity and choices. For individuals who have this definition of freedom, it involves having free will, to have dignity or to have your humanity recognized by others, and being able to make decisions in your own right and on your own terms. An individual who is free from modern slavery has their dignity recognized by others and can make unconstrained choices, especially choices regarding people, places, and employment. Our final definition is that freedom is resilient self-perception and dignity. What's most important about freedom under this definition is knowing your own worth and knowing that it does not depend on other people, to stop believing the lies others have told you about yourself and about the world, so that those lies no longer have power over you. Being healed from the damaging effects trafficking had on you and healed from the physical harm that trafficking did to you, and to have dignity, to have your humanity recognized by others. This definition of freedom emphasizes an individual regaining control over their self-perception. That's a very specific type of psychological recovery from human trafficking. And as important as it is to be shown dignity by others, it's at least as important that survivors be able to recognize their own humanity and to treat themselves with dignity. So what do these US definitions have in common? 2 of the same themes from the UK definitions are true across these 4. First, free will is the most important aspect in 2 of these US definitions. And resilience is central to 2 definitions as well. But once again, each of these 2 definitions has its own idea about what resilience means. So once again, we can't condense these into fewer definitions if we want to remain true to how participants defined freedom in reality. Rather, to extend our analogy of sitting in a theater, those themes can help us understand who might be seated more closely to one another or farther away from one another. I'm going to end where we began, by asking why this is important. First, this study allows those of us in the anti-trafficking field to better understand one another. Q methodology can act a bit like a mirror. It maps and orders individuals' perspectives, and the results reflect back an image of our own shared understandings of freedom. Because we don't talk about the substance of freedom regularly, as many of my participants told me, this research is like us being able to look into a mirror for the first time. And it's not just about us understanding each other, it's also about understanding ourselves at a local or even an organizational level. I showed you country level results today, but I've also broken down this study to the community level for the 6 locations I visited. I've shared those local findings with individuals and organizations so that they can better understand what definitions of freedom are influencing local policies, practice, and advocacy. Second, having a glimpse in the mirror means we can discuss what we see. This has already started to happen at some of the research locations. I've gotten feedback that people have been talking about freedom with each other, sometimes for the very first time. This is helping practitioners who work together understand why their colleagues do the things they do, and they're understanding new perspectives on freedom that can help them work together to support survivors in even more insightful and innovative ways. My plan is to expand this study to give us an even clearer reflection of ourselves at the national level and to help more communities understand the local implications of defining freedom. And of course, I plan to continue engaging and supporting by taking part in these conversations myself. Finally, we can think about how to start measuring freedom. We continually look for ways to define and measure modern slavery, always looking for greater accuracy so that we can shape effective policies and practices to end it. But we need to pay the same attention to freedom, whether locally or on a national scale. For example, being able to measure freedom can help caseworkers understand how their clients are progressing and how to best support them toward freedom. It can help with program monitoring, evaluation, and even grant writing. And it can give us an evidence-informed framework for freedom that is relevant to both protection and partnership in the US's anti-trafficking paradigm. The 49 cards that participants sorted in this study contained ideas from the past, as well as ideas from our own time. In part, this is because language and ideas from an earlier anti-slavery movement are still influencing how we think and speak about freedom today. But it was also because abolition was imperfect in the past. One of the things we got wrong was that we neglected to define freedom. So, as is still the case, we will often casually use the word freedom to mean simply the opposite of slavery. Well, many of the study participants, and I'm sure many of you at this conference, would say that that's an underdeveloped idea of freedom. Freedom is much more substantial and much more aspirational than that. This time around, as we work to end human trafficking and modern slavery, 40.3 million people stand to step into freedom. We need to know the substance of freedom itself, and we need to aspire to freedom, not just to the absence of slavery, if we are to do justice by those survivors and by the next generation who stands to inherit a free world from us. Thank you.